nearly 50 years ago, we started research on cannabis, and surprisingly, we were one of the very few groups in the world that did research on this topic. And the reasons could have been legal. Many departments of chemistry and biology and in the universities could not go ahead doing research in this field because of the legal aspects. And we were surprised to find out when we started work in this field that the active compound in cannabis, in marijuana, in hashish, had never been isolated in pure form, and therefore people could not use it in the fields of biochemistry or biology because it was just not available. And modern science requires exact amounts. One cannot say we took cannabis for research. One has to say we took a certain amount of a particular compound in order to do research. And therefore there was essentially no research in biochemistry or pharmacology, and essentially no research in the clinical science. Well, once we identified THC, elucidated its structure and synthesized it, it became possible to use cannabis, and then within our lab, in collaboration with many biological labs, and to a certain extent in collaboration with clinical labs, we started expanding the work in numerous fields. Many additional groups at the Hebrew University and in other universities in Israel went into that field, and so today, for example, we have nearly 20 groups within our school, within our university, that work on cannabinoids, and there is a collaboration between all these groups so we can advance the field much more than we expected, actually. Being in the field for nearly 50 years, obviously we have contact with most of the groups that have been doing research in cannabis or still doing research in cannabis throughout the world, whether it's in Europe, it may be in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, in France, and there is a lot of collaboration going on. Many of our research projects are in collaboration with groups, whether they are in Israel or abroad. And the reason for that is that this is a wide field in which there are many aspects. My laboratory is essentially a chemical lab working in collaboration with labs, particularly in whatever aspect we're working at the moment. So to give you an example, on head injury, we have done a lot of work with Professor Esther Shohami. She's a pharmacologist working on head injury. So together we have shown that many of the cannabinoids are effective. Now, one of the major developments within our lab, in collaboration with others, was the discovery of compounds present in our body, in our brain, that are the chemical basis of an endocannabinoid system. THC in the plant mimics the activity of these compounds, anandamide and 2-AG. So we found that one of these endogenous compounds, 2-AG, is a protective agent after closed head injury. Professor Shohami tried to show this by causing a minor head injury to mice, and then we gave these mice 2-AG, one of the endocannabinoids, and indeed we saw that the endocannabinoids lower the damage. So this is the type of work we're doing with many other groups. For example, in epilepsy. Many years ago, we found that cannabidiol, a non-psychoactive component of cannabis, lowers the epilepsy attacks in mice. So we thought it might be a good idea to try this in humans, and after quite a lot of work, it was possible to do it. We did the chemistry, we isolated a huge amount of cannabidiol, almost half a kilo of cannabidiol, which was sent to South America. They tried it on patients, and it was a small experiment. We had 15 patients, 8 got CBD, high doses, 7 were the placebos, and we showed that in those patients that were not being helped very well by the existing drugs, cannabidiol in half of them almost completely blocked the epilepsy attacks, and 3 of the others had much less. So here we showed that cannabidiol is an anti-epileptic drug. Now, over the last couple of years, this has been accepted by a huge amount of people, in particularly in pediatric epilepsy. And now in Israel, it is legal to administer cannabidiol from cannabis, extracts of cannabis containing cannabidiol, and this has been successful in many types of pediatric epilepsy. Basically about 60% of the children are helped to a large extent by cannabidiol. So these are 2 different, completely different types of work that we're doing. But we're also continuing our basic work, trying to find out the basis of cannabinoid action. And it has turned out that, that in addition to the compounds that we make in our body, and we call one of these compounds anandamide, there are almost 150 compounds which are chemically closely related, although they do not bind to the cannabinoid receptors. And one of these compounds, for example, is formed in the body in cases of osteoporosis, bone damage, which comes after in almost all women after the age of 55 because of hormonal changes. We found that in mice at least, one of these compounds is a very potent anti-osteoporotic agent. So here we have, again, a development from the cannabinoid system. These compounds are closely related to the endogenous compound, to the compounds we make in our body, and that are essentially cannabinoids. These additional compounds very closely related to anandamide, to the endogenous cannabinoids, but have completely different actions. So these are the several types of advances that we are involved in. And again, I want to stress, it is done in collaboration with a huge number of colleagues, and this has made possible the advance of the cannabinoid science, if you wish, in many directions. Many of the drugs that come from nature, the natural products, do not reach the market after several years, but as derivatives. For example, you cannot go to a pharmacy and buy penicillin. It doesn't exist as a drug. One can get derivatives of penicillin which are one way or another better than the original compound. Or there are compounds like a hormone that we produce, corticosterone. One cannot buy a cortisone in a drugstore. One can buy a derivative of cortisone, which is in many respects better than the original natural product. Well, this may happen with cannabinoids as well. It has not happened yet, but it may happen in the next 10 or 15 years. Compounds are produced that are semi-synthetic, namely one takes one of the compounds present in cannabis, cannabidiol, and makes a derivative. Now, cannabidiol is an excellent compound, but in some diseases, like in schizophrenia, one has to use amounts of nearly 800 milligrams per day that are more active, and then one can use lower amounts and see, if anything, better effects. And indeed, we have seen one of our compounds, cannabidiol with a fluoride atom, which is in this case a semi-synthetic compound, is better in several aspects, in anxiety, in depression, in schizophrenia, but all this has been done so far in animals models alone, not in humans, because we cannot reach that stage. And this work, this particular aspect, has been done with colleagues in Sao Paulo in Brazil. You ask about the difference between the medical cannabis and recreational cannabis. These two aspects should be completely separated. Medical cannabis has to be developed on the basis of where we stand in medicine. Namely, we should look at the side effects, we should look at the toxicity, if any, we should look at the doses needed for a particular disease, and all this should be done under supervision of people that are involved in medicine. So recreational cannabis is something else entirely. Recreational cannabis is a social issue. If in a country, society decides that cannabis is free to be used, then it will be used no matter of what happens with medical cannabis. These are two completely different aspects, and I don't think that people should come over and say, we want recreational cannabis because it is good in medicine. These should not be mixed. Medicine is based on medical aspects. Recreational cannabis is a social issue. Two different developments in the field of cannabis. Well, you ask, what do I see with cannabis in the future? Well, recreational cannabis, as I said, is a social issue, and it depends on the number of people that are using it. Probably the numbers will grow, and we shall see more and more people using cannabis throughout the world, and the governments have to decide whether to have completely free use of cannabis or not. Again, this is political, social issue, has to be decided, and probably, if it is decided to open completely the market, governments or the ministries of health will have to decide on the level of THC, because in some countries the level of THC available has become so high that the side effects are too potent. But this is a social issue. The medical issue is, as I said before, completely different, and there will be many developments in this field. For example, it has been shown that cannabidiol is a very potent drug in the field of autoimmune diseases. These are diseases in which the body attacks itself. We don't know in most cases why the body does that, but this is something that happens. For example, in pediatric diabetes, it's called diabetes type 1, the body attacks the cells that produce insulin, and many of these cells are damaged or even destroyed. So it has been found that in many of these autoimmune diseases, cannabidiol is very helpful. So I see that, I think, I cannot predict, but I think that within the next 5 years, 10 years, maybe a little bit more, cannabidiol or derivatives of cannabidiol will start to be employed in autoimmune diseases. We know today that there are many dozens of autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, for example, and I believe that here we can see very, very helpful advances, and maybe within 10 years we'll have numerous cannabinoid drugs in the market for a variety of diseases, autoimmune disease, schizophrenia, and so on.